Happy birthday.
Don't remind me.
Oh, your birth is definitely something to celebrate.
Hey everyone, I really hope this video doesn't come as a disappointment. I am working on more installments of Bella's books. I just want to read a few more before I upload a part 2, because as of right now, I just don't think I've read enough to warrant a video. But over the last few months, I've been kept up every night by one haunting question. So today, I'll be focusing more on books Bella hasn't read and answering the question, would Bella Swan like Twilight? Before we go any further, I do need to draw your attention to the Move to Higher Ground project. So throughout the books and films, many references are made to the Quileute tribe. This is a very real tribe living in La Push, Washington, just outside of Forks. And not only have these representations been incredibly harmful and problematic, in the nearly 2 decades since the series' release, the franchise has accumulated over millions of dollars, and the Quileute tribe hasn't seen a cent of it. And right now, more than ever, the Quileute tribe could really use financial support in the Move to Higher Ground project. The Quileute tribe lives in La Push, Washington, in a tsunami zone, which could wipe out the people and their culture. The mission behind Move to Higher Ground is to relocate and move to an area which is safer, protecting their people, culture, and practices. In the description is a link for more information about the Quileute tribe and the mission to move to higher ground. And if you are able, consider donating. Also, be sure to share the link. Thanks, everyone. I also want to note really quickly that these are all my opinions based on my perception of Bella, and I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments if you agree or disagree and why. I will also be sharing my own opinions of the books as well, so welcome to my book reviews of what has been published of the Twilight franchise so far. Yes. Absolutely yes. Bella's really into the gothic genre and romance, which means Twilight is right up her alley. Not to mention, it is inspired by Pride and Prejudice and Jane Eyre, which are 2 of her favorite books, so yes, absolutely teen angst and all. I think she'd be annoyed by Edward, but also find him incredibly charming. It's, that weird, at first you don't like him and then slowly you start to like him, the Pride and Prejudice effect, if you will. She may grant some sympathy towards him if she sees him as a Mr. Darcy type with the benefits of audience hindsight and dramatic irony, but in short, I think Twilight would absolutely become Bella's favorite book. Iconic. Wow. So good. Not good, but good. Nah, I love this book. I think Twilight is a favorite for everyone when they're reading the series. I think it's the first one, people just love it. The premise is simple, the ideas are there, the melodrama, everything is new and fresh. Still early in the journey, there is so much fun banter in this book, and I really love all of the back and forth happening. The character introductions are pretty solid, that it's easy to follow them throughout the rest of the series. Don't get me wrong, this book definitely has its imperfections, which I will kind of touch on later with some of my other book reviews, but out of all of the books, this one's my favorite. New Moon is a story of friendship with some Romeo and Juliet comparisons, so yes, Bella would once again really like it. I definitely think she would be Team Edward, but she'd love Jacob's character. I think Bella would really love following the friendship between Bella and Jacob. I think in some ways it is a really fun book to read, but then there's also a lot happening emotionally. Bella's feeling depressed. There's a lot happening. She's conflicted. It's a lot to process. There's a lot of highs and lows, and I think for that, Bella would really like it. To me, New Moon is another just solid choice up there with Twilight. I think this is another favorite people have. I think as far as the film goes, it's one of the ones that's constructed better and ends up being a favorite of people. I like the warmer aesthetic of the film, but my personal favorite is the blue tint of the Twilight film. It's something I wish they'd kept throughout the other movies, but I think the warm tint for New Moon really works. My favorite parts of New Moon are the vampire sections, just because I really like Twilight for the vampires, and that's more my style. Also, Jacob's character slowly starts to go downhill, so for me, it's also incredibly frustrating to read or to watch. But out of all of the books, as an engaging story, I think New Moon is probably the most effective, and I think that's because we already had an established world, and we were able to look outside of Bella and Edward's relationship for the first time because Twilight had a center on it so much. Then we have Eclipse. I think she would like the references being made to Wuthering Heights because it is one of her favorite novels of all time, but I also think the book would greatly frustrate her, whether she's annoyed with Jacob or Edward or Bella. There's just a lot of frustration to be had around that book, and I think it's a similar frustration for what it's like to read Wuthering Heights. But, quick twist here, if we're looking at this from the perspective of vampire Bella using the book to look back on her human memories, I think Eclipse would just frustrate her even more, because the thing about Eclipse is that so many terrible things happen to her, and I don't think she'd enjoy reading about them. There are a lot of really intimate and awkward moments, and I don't think those are things she'd really want to relive. I think they're better just left alone. Okay, so aside from Twilight, Eclipse is actually my favorite, and so many people ask me how Eclipse could possibly be my favorite. And here's the thing, I love the comedy. This book is so funny. I love the chemistry. These characters are great. This book does so many things wrong, as they all do, and so much happens in this book. It's a trip. I love this trip. It is unhinged. Also, yeah, I do skip the first part of chapter 15 because it is incredibly triggering for me, but this book, I have read this book so many times. I definitely prefer the movie, actually, because it shows more of the vampire army, but the book is classic. The thing with Twilight is that it introduces its final villains way too late into the story, even though Edward's technically the main villain throughout the book. Even though you never see things from the army's perspective, at least they're introduced as a threat early on. And you could kind of make the same argument with the wolves in New Moon. Not that they're really the enemy, it's just the premise of the wolves is introduced early. So between this and New Moon, I think they do some really interesting things as far as storytelling goes. But Twilight is still my favorite. Let's make that clear. It's still my favorite, but Eclipse is second, because vampires. And then there's Breaking Dawn. I think there's parts of the novel she'd like. Some of them are reminiscent of Jane Eyre, especially in the wedding scene. The relationship between Bella and Edward, she'd like it, yeah. I think everything else would just be annoying to her. Again, so many embarrassing moments, intimate scenes, and pregnancy, and her favorite books don't really include these things. Like I said, I think she'd really like The Wedding because it is in some ways very similar to Jane Eyre, but I don't know how much Bella would really like the overall book. After reading this book, I decided that reading it once was more than enough. This story was all over the place. Just watch the movies, or don't. I don't know. They're so different. There were definitely parts of this book that I did really like because I thought they were sweet or whatever, but I really don't like what becomes of Jacob's character after Eclipse, and even in sections of New Moon, he bothers me, so to get a whole chunk of the book from his perspective was not my cup of tea. However, it did make the story more interesting, considering Bella is dying for half of the story, and it wouldn't have been nearly as cohesive. However, this book is a trip. I swear, it's all over the place. All over the place. My mouth was hanging open the entire time I read it, which maybe is a good sign of a good book. This is not one of those times. It's certainly something. However, what I love most about this book is the quotes. Oh my god, there's so much banter between Alice, Edward, and Bella especially, and this book is genuinely so funny, and I love the characters' dialogue, and maybe that's because it's one of the longer books out of the entire series, but there's so much comedy gold. Don't get me wrong, the dialogue in these books isn't the greatest, but it does make me laugh a lot, and I love these characters. Bella wouldn't like it. All of the negative self-talk and adoration for Bella would be an immediate no for her. Healthy relationship, I know. Bella also doesn't really reference mythology outside of comparisons to Edward resembling a statue and an angel. Not that I don't think she wouldn't appreciate the reference or be into it, I just don't think she'd be into the idea of Edward comparing himself to Hades. However, in a lot of her favorite literary relationships, these guys are super melodramatic. If we're separating her from the story, then I think it's so reminiscent of some of her favorite male protagonists that she then would like it. So I'm not sure where she would sit as far as this book goes. I think if we're taking it from, oh, she knows Edward, then I think she wouldn't like it. If we're taking it from, I'm just a reader reading a book, which is more what I wanted this video to be about. If we're looking at it from that way, then yeah, she would like it. I think. I don't know. But I think. Okay, so Midnight Sun is my favorite. Hands down. This book is so unhinged. It's so chaotic. I love it. The way Edward talks and sees the world is honestly so funny. He's incredibly patronizing and just done with everyone. He is my favorite 17-year-old, 121-year-old. This book is a masterpiece. Thank you. Okay, so Bree Tanner was one of the newborns in Victoria's army who were sent to hunt down Bella in Eclipse. Bree's character is really interesting because she shows up at a time when Bella has made up her mind about becoming a vampire, but she's still going through these moments of doubt. Bella's main concern throughout Eclipse is that she'll lose her humanity completely. Bree's character operates as a sort of foil. She shows Bella the possibility of what she could become as a newborn. That concept is extremely cool and definitely worthy of its own story, which is where the short second life of Bree Tanner comes in. This story specifically focuses on the army shenanigans from the perspective of Bree Tanner as she goes through her new life as a vampire. In the novel, Bree falls in love and ultimately just wants to live a life of peace. This is something I think Bella would find incredibly relatable. However, nothing really happens in this book. There isn't a lot of action, or really any. Not that there's much in the other books either, but I don't know how much Bella would get into it aside from the love story happening. As far as the story goes, I would shape it as a slight enemies to lovers, but it all happens so quickly that I would say if I use the term incredibly loosely. It's technically not even enemies. Bree just isn't sure about trusting the other vampires, which given their behavior and the way they've been groomed, it makes sense. Considering how easily Bella comes to trust Edward in Twilight, I don't know how much she'd relate to this dynamic, but I do think she'd at the very least sympathize with Bree and the pain she goes through. This relationship dynamic is one I've had yet to really come across in her favorite books. Maybe the closest would be Amy and Laurie from Little Women. Hear me out. When Amy and Laurie reunite, he's very scandalous. He's in his villain era, I suppose, and she's very wary of him. And I think this shift in their dynamic where she goes back to trusting him is somewhat similar to the way in which Bree slowly develops trust, but even this comparison, I know, is a stretch. Anyways, I think Bella would maybe find this book very relatable and their relationship in some ways very relatable. I think she'd be able to connect to the love aspects of it. I think it would even maybe make her cry. But as far as the other stories go, it just doesn't seem to connect to some of her other favorite literature. So I think this one comes from more of a personal adoration than a literary adoration. I hope that made sense. I just mean this to say that Bella would appreciate it as a relatable story rather than an actual piece of fiction. So, anyways. Unfortunately, I went into this book with some pretty big expectations. I mean, it's a vampire army, so I expected that to be frickin' awesome. I'd heard it was the best book in the entire franchise, which made me so intrigued. If you've read Twilight, then you know these books are incredibly hit or miss. They are by no means masterpieces, but I still love them for their goofy characters, teenage angst, and sarcasm. I'm not of the opinion that it's perfect in writing, but I enjoy the series, and to hear that there may actually be a good book in the bunch with a compelling story, characters, and good writing got me really hyped. People really seemed to like Bree in both the book and the movie, and I also found her character really intriguing. Also, the premise of a vampire army is so fascinating and full of possibilities that I was so ready to sink my teeth into it. I was very excited to read this book. I hated it. Now I know hate is a strong word, but I really don't like this book. This story had so much potential and possibility, and instead it was really boring. A whole lot of nothing happened. I didn't feel sympathetic with Bree by the end of it, nor did I dislike her. I think she's very likable, and there seemed to be so much that was omitted, and then a lot of unnecessary details about really boring stuff that, even though her story is incredibly sad, I just didn't connect to it at all. Nothing really happened. It takes place over the span of months. So I went in with the expectation that we'd at the very least see how Bree became a vampire and how that was for her, but instead there are a whole 3 months which are just explained in passing. It's a short read, sure, but these pages are misused. They do not serve a story. I would not be upset if it were longer, if it meant we actually got something cool out of it. It's a vampire army. How could it possibly be boring? It was so difficult to get through this book. Okay, so maybe it's not fair to talk about this one because I technically haven't finished reading it yet, but I've gotten through about half the book so far, and I will say my thoughts so far is that it's just so similar to Twilight that I don't see how Bella couldn't not like it, but then at the same time, I don't think she'd like it as much as Twilight. I definitely think she'd appreciate the biology scene for its vocabulary, but there's also a lot of medical jargon sprinkled in throughout the book, and that doesn't really seem to be her forte when it comes to the sciences. She also doesn't reference 20,000 Leagues as a favorite of hers, but she does like science fiction, so maybe she'd connect to that. Life and Death still feels like Pride and Prejudice, so I do think she'd like it for its similarities in the same way she'd like Twilight. I just don't think her thoughts would differ too much from Twilight. The characters who are annoying are still annoying. The characters who are likable are still somewhat likable. The most drastic change is that you're getting the male perspective, and I don't think Bella would have any difficulty reading from this perspective, but for a lot of the favorite books that she mentions, some of them tend to focus more on a female protagonist than a male protagonist. I think given the situation that Beau and Bella are supposed to be the same character, I think she would ultimately find it easier to relate to this perspective because these are thoughts that she has herself, so in that way they are very similar, but I don't know, I think this one's really a toss-up, but given the fact that I think she would like Twilight and her love for Pride and Prejudice, I do think she would like this book. So, I don't like this one, and I also don't not like it, but I also really don't like it. I'm in a weird place, because this book is just gender-bent Twilight, and I really like Twilight, so in some ways, I really like this story, and I think gender-bent Twilight is a really cool concept, although personally, I would prefer an Edith and Bella story or even an Alice and Bella story, but c'est la vie. I dislike this book more for the reason it exists in the first place. Stephenie Meyer saw the criticisms around Twilight and said, okay, I'll just change everyone's gender and keep all of the problematic parts because nothing was learned from this. My understanding is that the issue isn't that Bella is a damsel, but rather that she has to be so dependent on other people to save her life. I think you can have a damsel, but still there's a balance to it. She's never allowed to do anything with the exception of cutting her hand in Eclipse, and that was sort of like a one-time thing. And yeah, no matter what the gender is, being obsessive in a relationship just isn't healthy. I feel like this wasn't serving any purpose. However, in saying that, I do think Stephenie Meyer does a really good job of capturing teenage love and all of the emotions that come with it. I think that's true for this book and Twilight, as well as New Moon especially. And yeah, there were a lot of changes made to the story because of the gender bending, which Stephenie argued wouldn't happen happen, but then it totally, completely did. And there are also moments in the book meant to reflect feminism, but it's not actually feminism. And by writing this book, it just further proved the validity of everyone's criticism, so why are we even here? There's this whole thing in Twilight where Bella doesn't believe Edward could hurt other people, not because he isn't capable, just that he wouldn't. She sees good in him. At first, Beau has difficulty picturing Edith hurting someone because he describes her as delicate. Like, those are drastically different reasons for believing someone wouldn't hurt others. And then later he says it's her confidence which made it clear to him that she's capable. He just has difficulty believing it. But then he later says that he can't see her doing those things because she's Edith and she's gone out of her way to ensure his safety. So it's a whole mix of things, but in part, some of it has to do with her appearance and how tiny she is. In one scene when, in Twilight, Bella gets on Edward's back, Beau hesitates because of how tiny Edith is. And I don't know, like, yeah, she's smaller than he is because it sounds like he's very tall, probably 6 foot from the sounds of it, over 6 foot. But I don't know, I think it would be more fun if he just, climbed on her back. No hesitations about it because he trusts her that much. I think that's more fun to play with, but maybe that's just me. Also, there's these little details like Beau opening the door for Edith and a scene where he offers to carry her backpack, which is extremely heavy for him because of how strong she is, and other scenes that are only there because the genders have been swapped, and therefore we must acknowledge traditional gender roles, but not in a productive way. Also, quick side note, Bella's relationship with Renee isn't that great, but wow, did they really sink their teeth into her the second the book started. It just went in on Renee and never seemed to let up. I will say though, these are somewhat valid criticisms. She maybe isn't the best mother, but oh my God, this just seemed harsher than Twilight. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but Bella seemed way more forgiving despite acknowledging the pressure she's felt about growing up too fast. I want to thank you all so much for watching. Be sure to check out the link in the description for more information about how to support the Quileute tribe, and if you haven't seen part 1 of reviewing books recommended by Bella Swan, there is a link in the description. And make sure you subscribe so you're ready when part 2 is published. Stay awesome, and I hope you have a great day.